At 52, the deaf weaver everyone pitied got a letter from a wealthy widower. I wrote the letter on a Thursday. Sat at the roll-top desk my father left me, the one that smells of beeswax and old tobacco even now, and I wrote 4 drafts before the 5th one didn't embarrass me. Not because I was nervous. I told myself I wasn't nervous. I told myself it was a practical matter, a man alone on 1,100 acres, a household with no hand at the center of it, a name in town that people associated with money and quietness and grief. Practical. That's what I told myself while I was scratching out the 3rd draft, because I'd started to sound like a land deed. Her name had come to me through Mabel Forsyth, who ran the dry goods on 4th Street and knew everything about everyone in 3 counties. I hadn't asked. I'd stopped by for lamp oil, and Mabel had looked at me the way women look at a man they've decided needs managing, and she'd said, "There's a woman over in Cutter Creek you ought to write to." I said I wasn't looking. Mabel handed me my lamp oil and said, "That's exactly why you should." I didn't write for 6 weeks. Then one night in October I came in from the north pasture, and the house was so quiet I stood in the doorway for a full minute before I could make myself go inside. The supper I'd left on the stove had burned to a black crust on the bottom of the pot. I ate what I could scrape off the sides and washed the pot in cold water and went to bed with the lamp still burning, because I couldn't be bothered to reach across and pinch it. Lay there looking at the ceiling while the flame threw shadows around. That was the night I decided Mabel Forsyth was probably right. Her name was Dora Marsh. She was 52 years old. She'd been deaf since she was 19, a fever that came and went in 3 days and took her hearing with it when it left. She'd never married. She lived alone in a 2-room house on the edge of Cutter Creek, and she wove blankets, rugs, saddlecloths, sometimes table runners for the town women who wanted something finer than what the catalog offered. Mabel had told me this as though it was plain and simple, and it was. Plain and simple. I turned it over for 6 weeks, and plain and simple is what it stayed. The 5th draft said, "My name is Caleb Rourke. I ranch north of Enid. My wife passed 4 years ago. I run cattle and some horses, and the land does well enough. I'm not a man of many words on paper or otherwise. I have been told you are a person of steadiness and good character, and I believe I am the same. I'm not looking to be pitied or fussed over, and I imagine you are not either. If you are willing to correspond, I would like to know you better before either of us decides anything further. If you are not willing, I understand completely and wish you well." I read it twice, folded it, sealed it before I could change my mind. I didn't sleep well the 2 weeks I waited. Not because I was anxious, I told myself. Because October was turning and the north pasture fence needed attention, and I had a gelding with a soft hoof that was making me watchful. That was why. Her reply came on a Tuesday. The envelope was small, cream-colored, the handwriting careful and precise in a way that told me she'd thought about every word. I sat in the truck outside the post office and opened it right there. She wrote, "Mr. Rourke, I received your letter and read it several times. I want to tell you something plainly since you seem to prefer plainness. Most men who have written to me over the years did so out of some idea that a deaf woman would be easier to manage than a hearing one, or cheaper to keep, or less likely to argue. I could see it in the letters without them saying so. Yours did not read that way. It read like a man who is tired and honest. I am also tired and honest. I would be willing to correspond further if you can tell me one thing you genuinely like to do when no one is watching. Not work, something else." I sat there in the truck a good while. Then I drove home, went to the desk and wrote back. When no one is watching, I read. Mostly history, sometimes poetry, though I wouldn't say that in town. I have a shelf of books my wife never knew the half of because I kept them in the barn. I don't know why the barn. They're in the house now. There's a Thomas Hardy I've read 4 times and I'm not sure I understand it yet, but I keep going back. She wrote, "I knew a woman who read Hardy. She said he wrote about people who almost made it. I think that's right. I like that you kept books in the barn. A man who is a little secretive about the things he loves is usually protecting something real." I read that sentence 5 times. We wrote back and forth through November and December. She wrote about the loom, about the particular satisfaction of a pattern coming true after you've made 3 mistakes getting there, about the way Cutter Creek smelled in the first freeze, like iron and pine, and something she couldn't name that she associated with her mother. I wrote about the horses, about what the land looked like in the gray light before sunrise when it belonged only to itself, about my son in Tulsa who called on Sundays and ran out of things to say after 10 minutes, and I let him because I didn't have much more to say either. She wrote back, "That's not a failure, that's just 2 quiet men on a telephone. Some fathers and sons talk too much to cover the fact that they don't know each other. Yours sounds like he knows you well enough to sit in silence with you." I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd been calling it a failure for 4 years. I asked her in January if I could come to Cutter Creek, not to decide anything, just to meet. She wrote back, "Yes, come on a Saturday. I'll be at the loom until noon." I drove the 2 hours on a morning so cold the road had a white skin of frost that crackled under the tires. I found her house at the edge of town the way she described it, a low frame building with a covered porch and a woodpile stacked tight against the north wall, smoke from the chimney. I sat in the truck for a moment. Here is what I noticed when she opened the door. She was shorter than I'd pictured. Her hair was gray at the temples and dark elsewhere, pulled back with a plain pin. She wore a brown work dress, and her hands were the hands of someone who used them seriously, the fingers square at the tips, a callus along the left thumb from the shuttle, a small scar on the back of the right hand. She looked at me steadily and directly, the way people who can't hear voices learn to look, reading what the face does. She didn't smile right away. She assessed. Then she stepped back and let me in. The loom was in the main room, massive and wooden and threaded with something dark red and cream. There was a wood stove against the east wall throwing good heat, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books I noticed immediately and then tried not to stare at, a kitchen at the back. Everything was clean and considered. She had a small chalkboard hung on a nail by the door. She picked up the chalk and wrote, "Coffee." I said yes. She couldn't hear me, but she'd already turned toward the kitchen. When she came back with 2 cups, she set one in front of me and sat across the table, and looked at me again with that same direct steadiness. I'd been warned that conversation would be different. I hadn't fully understood what different meant. I found myself choosing words more carefully because I had to write or gesture or speak slowly enough that she could read my lips, and what that meant, I realized after the first half hour, was that I was only saying things I actually meant. There was no filler, no throat clearing, no talking just to fill a room. She watched me when I spoke, and when she responded she wrote on the chalkboard or on a small notepad she kept in her dress pocket, and what she wrote was always direct and sometimes surprising, and once, when I said something I meant to be a small joke, she looked at me for a moment and then wrote, "That was actually funny. I'll allow it." I laughed. She watched me laugh. She wrote, "You don't do that much." I said no. She wrote, "It looks good on you." We ate the dinner she'd made, a beef stew with bread, nothing fancied up, and I watched her move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd arranged her world to suit herself. She kept a mirror angled above the stove, so she could see if someone entered the room behind her. When something fell on the floor, she felt it through her feet before she looked. She'd built a life that worked on her own terms, and there was nothing pitiful about any of it. I wondered what people meant when they said pitied. I wondered what they were seeing. After dinner, she showed me the loom, ran her hand along the threads, and then picked up the shuttle and showed me the motion, slow enough that I could see how the weft went through. She wrote on the notepad, "It's not complicated. People think it is. The complicated part is the pattern, keeping track of where you are so you don't have to tear it out." I wrote back on the notepad, "Most things are like that." She looked at that, then at me. She wrote, "Yes." I drove home in the dark with the heater going and the road black and empty in front of me, and I thought about the way she'd looked at me at the table, not the second or third time, but early on, When I'd said something about my son and what I'd thought was failure, and she tilted her head a little and looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to see accurately. Not with sympathy. Accuracy. Like she was deciding what was real. I wrote her the next Wednesday. I said, "I'd like to come again if you're willing." She wrote back, "I was wondering when you'd ask." Yes. February I came back. March she came to the ranch. That was different watching her in my space. She walked the house slowly the first hour, looking at things, stopped at the bookshelf for a long time. Picked up the Thomas Hardy, looked at the spine, set it back. Went to the window that faces north toward the pasture and stood there a while with her arms folded and the morning light on her face. Then she turned and wrote on the notepad, "It's a good house. It needs someone in it." I said, "I know." She watched my mouth, then she nodded slowly. We walked the north pasture in the afternoon. The grass was still winter pale, the sky low and heavy with the kind of clouds that threaten but don't deliver. I had a 3-year-old mare that had been skittish with everyone since she came to me, tended to wheel away when you approached. She let Dora walk up and put a hand on her neck. I stopped and watched that happen. Dora didn't look back at me. She just stood there with her hand flat on the mare's neck and the horse's ears swiveling, uncertain and then not uncertain. On the drive back to the house I said, "That horse doesn't let most people near her." She read my lips and wrote, "Animals can tell when you're not going to waste their time." That night at the table I asked her as plainly as I could manage if she would consider coming here permanently. I'd thought about how to say it for 2 weeks. I said, "I'm not asking you to give up anything. I know you have a life in Cutter Creek and a loom and a house and arrangements that work for you. I'm not asking you to shrink. I'm asking if there's room for me in it, or room for you in mine, or some version of both." I know what people would say. A wealthy man, a deaf woman, it has the look of a transaction. I don't care what it looks like. I know what it is. She read my lips and she didn't write anything for a moment. She just looked at me. Then she wrote, "I've been told my whole life that I was difficult, that I was a burden in waiting, that any man who took an interest was doing me a favor. I stopped believing that a long time ago, but I kept it in the back of my mind the way you keep a stone in your boot, just there, just a small wrongness you stop noticing. Your letter was the first one I ever got that didn't have a favor in it somewhere." She paused, then wrote more, "I don't need rescuing and you don't need managing. That's a better start than most people get." Then she wrote, "Yes." I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held mine, and we sat there for a while with the lamp burning between us and the wind going around the north corner of the house the way it always does, that low push and give, and it was the quietest and the most full I had felt in 4 years. She moved to the ranch in May, brought the loom in a wagon, which took 2 men and most of a morning to get through the door. She set it up in the room off the kitchen that had been used for storage, cleared it out herself, arranged the light from the east window just so. I built her a shelf along the west wall for her yarns. She kept the house in Cutter Creek, rented it to a young couple, schoolteacher and his wife, her terms her money. I hadn't suggested it either way, it was hers to decide. That summer I learned to speak more of what I was thinking, and less of what was convenient to say. It's a different thing, those two. Most men don't realize how much of what they say is just weather, filling the air, smoothing the silence, making a thing seem easier than it is. When every word costs you a gesture, or a written line, or a careful facing of your mouth toward the light, you find out pretty quickly which words you actually need. I needed fewer than I'd thought. What I needed was this: to be sitting at that table in the evening with the lamp lit and the loom quiet and her across from me with a book or her notepad, and the north pasture dark beyond the glass, and the two of us in a house that felt like someone lived in it. In September we rode the north pasture on a Sunday morning, the kind of morning where the air is still enough that you can hear each hoof fall separate. She rode the mare who'd led her close back in March. Dora had been working with her all summer, calm and patient, and unhurried the way she did everything. The mare moved easy under her now. We stopped at the high ground where you can see the creek to the east and the house to the south, and a long way of open country in every direction. The light was coming low and gold off the grass. She was looking out at the country. I was looking at her. She felt me looking, turned, read my face. Then she wrote on the little notepad she'd taken to keeping in her coat pocket and held it toward me. "Stop, I can see you just fine from here." I took the notepad, wrote under her line, "I know." She took it back and read it. Her mouth did that thing it did when something landed right, not quite a smile, a settling, like a thread going taut just enough to hold the pattern. She tucked the notepad back in her pocket, and we sat there on the horses with the October coming in the air, and the grass moving a little in the east wind, and the house down there with smoke starting from the chimney where I'd banked the fire before we left. And I thought about the letter I'd written at that roll-top desk in the dark. The fourth draft crossed out, the fifth one sealed before I could think too hard. A man writes a letter hoping for something practical. He ends up with something he didn't know he was missing, which is someone who sees him plain and chooses him anyway, and finds that enough and means it. That's all it was. That's everything it was.